The heavy oak door of the king's bedchamber was only slightly ajar, a sliver of candlelight bleeding into the cold corridor. Isolde, Queen of Oakhaven by name alone, stopped, the chill of the stone floor biting into her bare feet. "She is a ghost, Edric." A woman's voice, lyrical, cruel, and undeniably Lyra's, drifted out. "A pale shadow shivering in your halls. Why do you suffer her presence?" A low rumble, the sound of the Alpha King chuckling, vibrated through the wood. "She is a necessity. A cursed necessity that binds the northern clans. But she is fragile. She bleeds at a harsh word." Isolde pressed her hand against the rough stone wall, the air suddenly too thin to breathe. The silence in the corridor was absolute, save for the rhythmic dripping of water from a leaky sconce somewhere in the distance. Isolde didn't move. She couldn't. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, far more potent than any physical blow Edric had ever dealt her during his volatile moods. Fragile, a cursed necessity. She backed away from the sliver of light, her movements slow, mechanical. She didn't run. Running would imply panic, and she was far past panic. A cold, crystalline clarity had settled over her, a detachment that felt both foreign and profoundly empowering. For 3 years, she had endured the suffocating atmosphere of Oakhaven. She had tolerated the whispers of the courtiers, the pitying glances of the servants, and the indifferent, sometimes outright hostile presence of her husband, King Edric. The warrior king, they called him. A man forged in the brutal wars of the southern marches. A man whose skin was marked by steel and whose heart seemed equally scarred. He had married her not for love, nor even for lust, but for an ancient pact that tied her bloodline, the last of the old mystic lords of the crags, to the stability of his newly won kingdom. She reached her own chambers, a stark contrast to the opulent warmth of Edric's suite. Here, the tapestries were threadbare, depicting forgotten legends of ravens and wolves, and the hearth fire had long died down to embers. Isolde stood in the center of the room, the faint moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the floorboards. She looked at her reflection in the polished bronze mirror. Pale skin, dark hair cascading like a shroud, eyes that held the sorrow of a dying lineage. A ghost, Lyra had called her. Perhaps it was time to prove them right. Ghosts, after all, do not stay where they are unwanted. They vanish. She went to the heavy oak wardrobe, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of her ancestors. Inside hung the velvet gowns and silk shift dresses Edric had provided, the uniform of her captivity. She ignored them. Instead, she reached for a simple, coarse wool cloak, a garment she had brought with her from her childhood home, a relic of a time before the curse, before the marriage. She did not pack a bag. Taking belongings meant taking memories, taking pieces of this prison with her. She would take nothing. No jewels, no gold, no extra garments. Just the clothes on her back and the cloak. As she fastened the iron clasp at her throat, a faint glimmer caught her eye. It was the ceremonial dagger, a slender blade of dark steel with a handle wrapped in worn leather, resting on her vanity. It wasn't a weapon of war, but an heirloom, whispered to have been forged in the dying fires of the old gods. She hesitated, then slid it into the hidden sheath beneath her skirts. A ghost must be prepared for the shadows. She didn't write a letter. Explanations were for those who cared to understand, and Edric clearly did not. He saw her only as a strategic piece on his board. Let him solve the puzzle of her absence. The castle was silent as she slipped out. She knew the hidden passages, the forgotten servant routes that bypassed the main guard posts. She moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years trying to be invisible. The chill night air hit her as she finally emerged through a small postern gate. The immense, brooding silhouette of Oakhaven looming behind her. Before her lay the whispering pines of the Blackwood, a dense, ancient forest that even Edric's soldiers avoided. It was dangerous, filled with predators and rumors of older, darker things. But to Isolde, the impenetrable darkness felt like an embrace. She didn't look back. She stepped into the trees, the darkness swallowing her whole, long before the first light of dawn could break the horizon. The morning sun had barely crested the jagged peaks of the eastern mountains when the scream shattered the uneasy peace of Oakhaven. It came from Isolde's chambers. Edric, still clad in his sleeping breeches, burst through the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the sword he hadn't had time to strap on. He found a young maid, face pale, pointing at the undisturbed bed and the empty room. "Where is she?" Edric demanded, his voice a low growl that caused the maid to flinch. "I don't know, my king. The bed has not been slept in." Edric's jaw tightened. He strode to the wardrobe, tearing the doors open. The velvet gowns hung in neat, mocking rows. The jewelry box was full. Even her riding boots remained. The only thing missing was her heavy wool cloak. He turned, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the vanity where the ceremonial dagger usually rested. "Gone. Find Captain Thorn," Edric barked, stalking out of the room. The Alpha King's calm facade was fracturing. The cursed necessity was gone. Within the hour, the courtyard was a frenzy of activity. Hounds strained at their leashes, soldiers checked their gear, and horses stamped impatiently. Edric, now fully armored, stood by his destrier, his expression unreadable. Lyra approached, wrapped in a fur-lined mantle, her face a mask of feigned concern. "My lord, surely she hasn't gone far. She's too fragile for the wild." Edric didn't look at her. "She took nothing, Lyra. No food, no horse. And she took the dark blade." Lyra frowned, sensing the subtle shift in his tone. The amusement from the night before was gone. "The dagger? It's a trinket. It's a symbol," Edric corrected sharply, mounting his horse. "A symbol of the Crag Lords. If the northern clans discover she's missing, or worse, if she seeks them out, the treaty is void. We ride for the Blackwood. The hounds have her sent from the postern gate." Meanwhile, deep within the Blackwood, Isolde moved with a surprising, fluid grace. The forest was hostile. Roots snaked across the path like grasping fingers, and the canopy blocked out most of the daylight. But it was familiar. This was the environment her ancestors had tamed. The magic of the deep woods pulsing in her blood. Dormant, but not dead. She heard them before she saw them. The distant, rhythmic baying of the hounds. Edric had not wasted time. She paused, leaning against a massive oak, her breath pluming in the cold air. Fear, sharp and metallic, tasted on her tongue. The hounds were fast, trained to track deserters and criminals. But she was neither. She was prey, yes, but not common prey. She knelt, pressing her palm against the damp earth. She closed her eyes, focusing past the fear, searching for the connection she had long suppressed. The old stories her nursemaid had whispered in the dark came back to her. The wood remembers the old blood. She felt a faint vibration, a slow, deep thrumming that seemed to match her heartbeat. She drew her hand back, her fingers coated in dark soil. She began to smear the earth over her cloak, her face, her hair, It wasn't just to hide her scent. It was an act of surrender to the forest, a plea for camouflage. When she stood, she was almost indistinguishable from the shadows. The baying grew louder, closer. She could hear the shouts of the soldiers now, Edric's voice cutting through the trees. She didn't run. Running leaves a trail of disturbed leaves and broken twigs. Instead, she began to climb. She found a massive, ancient pine with low-hanging branches and pulled herself up, her movements silent, desperate. She climbed higher than a normal person would dare, until she was hidden within the dense needles, the rough bark scraping her hands. Minutes later, the hunting party burst into the clearing below. The hounds were frantic, running in circles, their noses to the ground where Isolde had stood moments before. Edric rode into the center, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. He looked furious, frustrated. "The trail ends here, sire," Captain Thorne reported, pulling hard on the leashes. "The dogs are confused." Edric dismounted, examining the ground. He saw nothing. No footprints, no broken branches leading away. "She can't have just vanished," Lyra said, riding up beside him, her horse skittish. Edric looked up, straight into the canopy. Isolde held her breath, pressing herself flat against the branch, the dark dagger clutched tightly in her hand. For a terrifying second, their eyes seemed to meet through the pine needles. Then Edric turned away. "Spread out. She's on foot. She couldn't have gone far." Isolde remained in the tree, silent as a wraith, as the hunt moved on, leaving her behind in the quiet, echoing woods. The descent from the ancient pine was agonizingly slow. Isolde's limbs trembled with cold and exhaustion, the adrenaline that had fueled her initial escape now ebbing away, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. When her feet finally touched the damp forest floor, she collapsed against the trunk, gasping for breath. The baying of the hounds had faded into a distant, mournful echo. But she knew better than to feel safe. Edric was a relentless hunter. He wouldn't give up easily. She forced herself up, the coarse wool of her cloak offering little protection against the biting chill of the encroaching evening. The blackwood was a labyrinth of twisted roots and dense, thorny undergrowth, its canopy so thick that the twilight felt like the dead of night. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every rustle of leaves sounded like a footstep. Isolde pressed on, guided only by an instinct she hadn't known she possessed. She had lived a sheltered life, a pawn moved across the political chessboard, first by her father, then by Edric. Survival in the wilderness was not a skill she had been taught. Yet, the deeper she ventured, the less alien the forest felt. She remembered fragments of tales whispered by her nursemaid, old Alara, before Edric's men had dragged her away for treasonous talk. Tales of the crag lords, her ancestors, who spoke to the trees and commanded the beasts. "The blood remembers," Alara used to say, her eyes gleaming with a fierce, protective light. Isolde touched the hilt of the ceremonial dagger hidden beneath her skirts. It pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. She drew it, the dark steel catching the scarce moonlight, filtering through the canopy. It felt lighter than it should, balanced perfectly in her trembling hand. Suddenly, a twig snapped with the sharpness of a whip crack. Isolde froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She dropped into a crouch, the dagger raised, her eyes straining against the darkness. From the undergrowth emerged not a soldier, but a wolf. It was massive, its fur the color of charcoal, its eyes glowing with a feral, yellow intensity. It didn't growl. It simply stood there, blocking her path, watching her with an intelligence that made Isolde's blood run cold. This was no ordinary beast. This was a creature of the deep wood, a predator that could tear her apart in seconds. She didn't run. She remembered the hounds, the frantic, mindless pursuit. This creature was different. It was assessing her. Isolde slowly lowered the dagger, placing it on the mossy ground between them. She met the wolf's gaze, refusing to look away, projecting a calm she did not feel. I am of the crags, she thought. A desperate plea to the ancient bloodline. I am not prey. The wolf took a step forward, sniffing the air. It lowered its massive head, its nose inches from the dark blade. Then it looked back up at Isolde. It didn't attack. Instead, it turned its head, gesturing with a subtle movement towards a dense thicket of brambles. Isolde hesitated, then slowly picked up the dagger and followed. The wolf moved with silent grace, weaving through the thorns as if they weren't there. Isolde struggled to keep up, her cloak snagging, her hands scratched and bleeding. They emerged into a small, hidden clearing. In the center lay a ruin, stones covered in moss and vines, the remnants of a structure that had stood long before Oakhaven was built. The wolf trotted to a collapsed archway and lay down, its yellow eyes fixed on her. Isolde understood. This was sanctuary. For tonight, at least. She slumped against a mossy stone, exhaustion finally pulling her into a dreamless, heavy sleep, guarded by the beast of the Blackwood. Back at Oakhaven, the atmosphere was toxic. Edric slammed his gauntleted fist onto the heavy oak table in the war room, the map of the Northern Territories shuddering under the impact. 3 days, he roared, glaring at Captain Thorne. 3 days, and you bring me nothing but excuses and tired hounds. Thorne, a seasoned veteran of the Southern Wars, stood rigidly at attention, his face tight. The Blackwood is dense, Your Grace. The tracks simply end. It's as if she vanished into thin air. People do not vanish, Captain. Edric spat, pacing the length of the room. They leave trails. They make mistakes. Find her. Lyra sat elegantly in a high-backed chair in the corner, nursing a goblet of spiced wine. She watched Edric's frantic pacing with a mixture of amusement and growing concern. This obsession with the missing queen was unbecoming of the Alpha King. Perhaps she fell into a ravine, Edric. Lyra offered, her voice smooth and placating. The woods are treacherous. Or perhaps a beast claimed her. She was always so delicate. Edric stopped and turned to her, his eyes blazing with a fury that made her flinch. You know nothing, Lyra. You see a fragile woman because that is all you are capable of seeing. You did not see her eyes when she looked at me. There was steel there, buried deep. He walked towards the map, tracing the dark expanse of the Blackwood. If she reaches the Crag Lords, if she tells them I drove her away, the alliance is broken. The northern flank will be exposed. We cannot afford a war on 2 fronts. Lyra set her goblet down, her expression hardening. Then send assassins, not soldiers. If she is dead, the alliance remains intact, cemented by tragedy. Her untimely demise in the treacherous woods. It's a tragedy the Crag Lords will mourn. But they will not blame you. Edric stared at the map in silence for a long time. The pragmatic cruelty that had won him the throne warred with a strange, unfamiliar knot of unease in his gut. He remembered the empty room, the missing dagger. He had underestimated her. That was a mistake he rarely made. No, he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. I want her found. Alive. I need to know how she evaded my hounds. I need to know what she's planning. He turned back to Thorne. Double the patrols along the forest edge. Send word to the border garrisons, and find me a tracker. Not a soldier, A real tracker? Someone who knows the old ways of the wood. Thorn nodded sharply and left the room. Edric turned to Lyra, his face a mask of cold resolve. Keep to your chambers, Lyra. Your presence here is distracting. Lyra's eyes flashed with anger, but she nodded tightly and swept out of the room, leaving Edric alone with the map and the growing realization that his cursed necessity might just be his undoing. Isolde woke to the sound of running water. She was stiff, cold, and hungry, but alive. The wolf was gone. She stood, stretching her aching limbs, and followed the sound of the water. She found a small, crystal-clear spring bubbling up from beneath a mossy rock. She drank greedily, the icy water reviving her senses. As she washed her face, she noticed something beneath the surface of the water. A stone, smooth and flat, with intricate runes carved into it. She reached in and pulled it out. The runes matched the carvings on her ceremonial dagger. She looked around the ruin with new eyes. This wasn't just a random pile of stones. It was a shrine, a place of power for her ancestors. She walked to the collapsed archway and cleared away some of the vines. More runes were revealed, telling a fragmented story of the Crag Lords, their connection to the earth and the beasts, and a prophecy of a Shadow Queen who would return the balance. Isolde traced the runes with trembling fingers. A Shadow Queen. Lyra had called her a pale shadow. The irony was not lost on her. She spent the day exploring the ruins, finding more clues, more pieces of a history that had been deliberately erased by Edric's conquering army. She found a cache of dried herbs and roots, preserved in a sealed stone jar. She recognized some of them from Alara's teachings, medicines, poisons, and things used for older, darker purposes. She was no longer just fleeing. She was discovering. The fear that had propelled her was being replaced by a cold, burning purpose. Edric had stripped her of her home, her family, and her dignity. But he had unknowingly driven her back to her roots. As night fell, she built a small, smokeless fire using dry moss and flint she found in the cache. She roasted a small hare she had managed to trap using a snare made from her own hair and vines. It was a meager meal, but it tasted better than any feast at Oakhaven. She sat by the fire, the ceremonial dagger across her knees. She felt a shift within her, a shedding of the fragile queen persona she had worn for 3 years. She was Isolde of the Crags, and she was going to reclaim what was hers. The wolf returned just as the moon reached its zenith. This time, it didn't come alone. Behind it, emerging from the shadows, were others. Wolves of all sizes, their eyes reflecting the firelight. They didn't attack. They formed a loose circle around the ruin, a silent, deadly perimeter. Isolde stood, the dagger in her hand. She didn't feel fear. She felt a connection, a primal understanding. She was their queen now. The Shadow Queen had awakened. Chapter is crucial for Isolde's transformation. She transitions from a victim fleeing to a woman embracing her heritage. The discovery of the shrine and the runes provides the necessary lore without a massive info dump. The wolves accepting her solidifies her new power. A fortnight had passed since Isolde vanished into the Blackwood. At Oakhaven, the initial frenzy of the hunt had settled into a grim, simmering tension. The northern clan leaders, once placated by the marriage, were now sending ravens demanding an audience with their queen. Edric's excuses of a sudden illness were wearing thin. The cursed necessity was proving to be the keystone of his entire northern strategy. In the muddy courtyard, Edric stood before a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very trees they sought to conquer. Kalen, a tracker from the deep borderlands, smelled of pine sap and old leather. His eyes, pale and sharp as a hawk's, scanned the Alpha King without a hint of the deference Edric usually commanded. "You say the trail ended at a tree, Your Grace." Kalen rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Trails do not end. They merely change." "My hounds lost the scent entirely," Edric replied, his patience fraying. "My captain believes she found a stream and waded upriver." Kalen knelt, running a calloused hand over the muddy ground where the hounds had last been kept. Hounds track the sweat of fear, the stench of a running prey. If she stopped fearing, if she became part of the wood, hounds are useless. Lyra, watching from a stone balcony above, let out a delicate, mocking laugh. "Are we paying this vagabond to tell ghost stories, Edric? She is a fragile girl. She likely starved within 3 days." Kalen didn't look up, but his jaw set. "The forest does not starve its own, lady. It feeds them. I will find her, King Edric. But I will go alone. An army makes the forest close its eyes. I must go quietly." Edric nodded curtly. "Bring her back, alive. If she refuses, bring proof of where she hides, deep within the Blackwood." The ruins were no longer just a sanctuary. They were a domain. Isolde sat cross-legged before the ancient stone altar, her eyes closed. The ceremonial dagger lay across her palms. She was no longer wearing the coarse wool cloak. Instead, she wore a garment woven from fallen vines, soft moss, and the shed undercoat of the wolves, a gift they had brought her piece by piece. She breathed in, and the shadows in the corners of the ruins seemed to stretch and deepen. She breathed out, and the wind rustled through the canopy in a synchronized sigh. The runes she had studied were not just words. They were a frequency, a heartbeat she had finally learned to match. The alpha wolf, the massive charcoal beast she called Cinder, rested his heavy head on her knee. Suddenly, his ears swiveled forward. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Isolde opened her eyes. The profound silence of the forest had changed. The birds had stopped singing. The insects were quiet. Someone was coming. Not a loud, clanking patrol, but someone who knew how to walk on dry leaves without breaking them. "Spread out," she whispered to the shadows. Cinder rose, his yellow eyes fixing on the dense tree line. Several other wolves melted into the undergrowth, becoming completely invisible. Isolde stood, picking up the dagger. The blade felt warm, humming with a low, kinetic energy. She did not feel the panic that had driven her from Oakhaven. She felt an ancient, grounded fury. She was the queen of the crags, and someone was trespassing in her court. Kalen moved with agonizing slowness. He had found the tree. He had found the microscopic scrape of a boot on a high branch. He had tracked broken cobwebs and bent grass for miles. Now he smelled wood smoke. Not a raging bonfire, but the clean, subtle scent of dry moss burning. He stepped through a thicket of thorns, his hand resting cautiously on the hilt of his hunting knife. He stepped into the clearing and froze. The ruins rose before him, draped in emerald vines, and standing in the center, flanked by the largest wolves he had ever seen, was the missing queen. But this was not the fragile, pale shadow described by the king's men. Her dark hair was unbound, wild, and tangled. Her eyes held the terrifying, fathomless depth of the deep woods. She did not look like a captive waiting to be rescued, nor a fugitive waiting to be caught. She looked like a deity of the earth, interrupted. Kalen, a man who had faced bears with a spear and survived avalanches, felt a cold knot of genuine terror form in his stomach. He slowly, deliberately raised his hands, showing his empty palms. He knew instantly that drawing a weapon would mean his death before he took a second breath. The wolves were utterly still, a dozen coiled springs waiting for a single word from the woman. "I mean no harm, Queen Isolde," Kalen said, his rough voice kept carefully level. "I am Kalen, a tracker." Isolde tilted her head, the movement eerily predatory. "Did my husband send you to drag me back by my hair, Kalen the tracker? Or did he send you to bring back my head? He asked me to find you." Kalen answered honestly. "He wants you alive. He wants his treaty," she corrected, her voice echoing strangely among the old stones, carrying a dual resonance, as if the ruins themselves were speaking with her. "He wants the northern flank secured. He does not want me." Kalen took a tentative step forward. A low snarl from Cinder stopped him dead. "The north is growing restless, Your Grace," Kalen said, trying a different tactic. "They demand to see you. Without you, blood will water the fields before the harvest." Isolde looked down at the dark dagger in her hand. The metal seemed to drink the meager light filtering through the trees. For a moment, the old Isolde, the girl who hated violence, who had abhorred the slaughter of the Southern wars, flickered in her chest. She could stop a war. All she had to do was put the wool cloak back on, walk out of the woods, and endure Lyra's mockery and Edric's indifference until she died. A cursed necessity, the words echoed in her mind, obliterating the moment of weakness. She looked back at Kalen, her eyes hardening into polished obsidian. "There will be blood regardless, Tracker. Edric built his throne on it. He cannot complain when the tide reaches his own boots." Isolde stepped down from the altar. The wolves parted for her. "I am not returning to Oakhaven. He will burn this forest to the ground to find you," Kalen warned, genuine concern bleeding into his tone. "He is the Alpha King." Isolde smiled, and it was a terrifying thing to behold, devoid of joy, full of ancient promises. Let him try. Let him march his iron and his fire into the Blackwood. "The earth is hungry, Kalen." She raised her hand, pointing the dagger at him. "Go back to the man who calls himself king. Tell him the pale shadow has found the dark. Tell him the pact is broken. The crag lords are awake, and their queen claims the Blackwood. If his soldiers cross the tree line, they belong to the forest." She turned her back on him, walking back toward the altar. The wolves stepped forward, forming a solid wall of fur and fangs, effectively ending the audience. Kalen didn't need to be told twice. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the pack, until the shadows of the trees swallowed him. 3 days later, Kalen stood in the great hall of Oakhaven. He looked exhausted, his clothes torn by thorns he had been too hasty to avoid on his return journey. Edric sat on the iron throne, Lyra standing at his side, a smirk playing on her lips. "Well?" Edric demanded. "Where is she? Did she perish?" Kalen looked at the king, then at the smirking mistress. He thought of the woman in the ruins, the wolves, the air that hummed with ancient power. "She is alive, Your Grace," Kalen said heavily. "I found her deep within the old ruins." "Then why did you not bring her back?" Edric roared, gripping the armrests of his throne. "Because she is no longer the woman you married," Kalen replied. The great hall fell dead silent. "She sent a message. She says the pact is broken. She claims the Blackwood. And she warned that any soldier who crosses the tree line belongs to the forest." Lyra burst into a peal of laughter. She claims the woods? The little mouse is playing at being a bear. Edric, she has clearly lost her mind from starvation. Edric didn't laugh. He stared at Kaelin, reading the absolute sincerity, the lingering fear in the hardened tracker's eyes. The knot in his gut, the one that had formed the night he realized she had taken the dagger, twisted violently. "Pay him," Edric ordered softly, his eyes never leaving Kaelin. "And double the guard on the northern wall." Lyra paced the length of her opulent chambers, her silk skirts swishing angrily against the carpets. Edric was acting like a coward. Since the tracker had returned, the king had refused to send soldiers into the Blackwood. He was fortifying Oakhaven, sending envoys to the north to desperately negotiate new terms, ignoring the obvious solution. Isolde was a liability. Mad or not, as long as she lived, the northern clans had a rallying cry. If she died in the woods, tragically mauled by beasts, the rebellion would lose its figurehead. Edric was too paralyzed by superstitions to do what was necessary. Lyra stopped by her window, looking out over the courtyard toward the dark, looming mass of the forest in the distance. She was not a queen by blood, but she understood power better than Edric ever would. Power belonged to those willing to strike the killing blow. She turned to her personal guard, a brutal man named Vayne, whose loyalty she had purchased with gold and promises of land. "Vayne," she commanded, her voice cold and decisive. "Take a dozen of your most discreet mercenaries. Go to the Blackwood. Do not return until you bring me that wretched woman's heart in a velvet box. The king is not to know until the deed is done." Vayne grinned, a jagged scar stretching across his cheek. "Hunting a madwoman in the woods. It will be our pleasure, my lady." That night, beneath the cover of heavy storm clouds, Vayne and his men slipped out of Oakhaven. They were armed with crossbows, heavy blades, and iron traps. They were not trackers. They were butchers. By dawn, they had penetrated deep into the Blackwood. The forest was unseasonably dense, the air thick and cloying. The mercenaries hacked at the undergrowth with machetes, making a racket that echoed for miles. Isolde felt them before she heard them. She was kneeling by the spring, watching the water ripple. A sharp pain pulsed behind her eyes, the forest reacting to the violent intrusion, the hacking of living wood. She stood up, her jaw clenched. Cinder whined, a low sound of distress, pacing nervously. "They bring iron and malice," Isolde murmured, her fingers wrapping around the hilt of the dark dagger. The runes on the blade began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. She did not wait for them at the ruins. She moved into the forest, swift and silent, the wolves fanning out around her like liquid shadows. Vayne's men were growing uneasy. The forest seemed to be actively fighting them. Roots tripped them, thorny vines snagged their armor, and the canopy was so thick that the midday sun barely pierced the gloom. "Quiet," Vayne hissed, holding up a hand. The hacking stopped. The silence that followed was unnatural. It was heavy, expectant. Then, the whispering began. It wasn't voices, but the wind moving through the leaves in a way that sounded like hushed, mocking laughter. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and writhe. "Witchcraft," one of the mercenaries muttered, raising his crossbow, his hands shaking. Suddenly, a massive branch from an ancient oak cracked and plummeted downward, pinning a mercenary to the ground with a sickening crunch. The man screamed, thrashing wildly. Vayne drew his sword. "Form a circle, form a—" He was cut off by a sound that froze the blood in their veins. A howl. Not a single wolf, but dozens. echoing from every direction, bouncing off the trees so it was impossible to tell where they were coming from. From the shadows, yellow eyes blinked open. Isolde stepped out from behind a massive trunk. She didn't raise a weapon. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, a manifestation of the forest's wrath. She raised the ceremonial dagger. The earth trembled beneath the mercenaries' feet. Thick, gnarled roots burst from the soil like skeletal fingers, wrapping around the men's ankles, dragging them down into the mud. Panic erupted. The men fired their crossbows blindly into the dark, the bolts thunking harmlessly into wood. The wolves lunged, not to kill, but to herd. Snapping jaws inches from faces, tearing armor and flesh just enough to induce absolute terror. "Run!" Vane screamed, his bravado shattering. He hacked frantically at the roots binding his leg, managing to free himself, and bolted back the way they came, abandoning his men. Isolde watched them flee, leaving their weapons and their wounded behind. She approached the man pinned by the branch. He whimpered, staring up at her as if she were a demon. She pressed the flat of her blade against the tree branch. With a groan of shifting wood, the branch rolled away. "Crawl back to Oakhaven," Isolde told the terrified man, her voice cold and resonant. "Tell Lyra that the shadow she mocked has teeth, and tell her she is next." The lone mercenary, broken and babbling, dragged himself into Oakhaven's courtyard 2 days later. The tale he told of living roots, unnatural darkness, and the queen commanding a wolf pack spread through the castle like a plague before Edric could silence him. Panic, raw and visceral, took hold of the garrison. Lyra, for the first time since Isolde's departure, looked truly afraid. She remained confined to her quarters, bolting the doors, jumping at every shadow cast by the hearth fire. She had underestimated the pale ghost, and the ghost had shown her teeth. Edric stood on the highest battlements, looking out over the sprawling canopy of the Blackwood. The northern clans were openly marching now, their banners spotted less than 50 miles from Oakhaven. They had heard the whispers. Their queen had not vanished. She had been driven out, and now she claimed the ancient lands as her own. They were coming not to rescue her, but to join her, effectively declaring war on Edric's rule. Captain Thorne approached, his heavy boots sounding loud in the tense silence. "The garrison is restless, Your Grace. Morale is non-existent. They say the forest itself is marching against us." "Let them talk," Edric muttered, his eyes fixed on the distant, dark tree line. "Superstition is the weapon of the weak. With respect, sire." Thorne hesitated, a rare break in his discipline. "It is not superstition if the trees are truly killing our men." Edric finally turned. He looked older, the strain of the past few weeks etching deep lines around his eyes. He had built his kingdom on iron and blood, conquering men with superior tactics and brute force. But how did one conquer the earth? How did one fight an enemy that commanded the very ground beneath their feet? He had made a catastrophic error. Not in marrying her, that had been necessary. His error had been in failing to see her. He had looked at Isolde and seen only a political tool, a fragile vessel for a bloodline. He hadn't bothered to understand what that bloodline truly meant. "Prepare my horse, Captain," Edric commanded, his voice tight. "And gather an honor guard. 10 men, no more." "Sire," Thorne asked, alarmed. "We cannot ride into the Blackwood with only 10 men. It is suicide." "We are not riding to fight, Captain. We are riding to negotiate." They left at dawn. The forest, which had seemed so impenetrable to Vane's mercenaries, parted for Edric. The thorny thickets seemed to pull back, the dense canopy allowing shafts of pallid sunlight to illuminate a clear, mossy path. It was a terrifying display of power, an invitation, or perhaps a trap. They rode for hours in profound silence. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the muffled thud of hooves on damp earth. Eventually, the path opened into the clearing containing the ancient ruins. Edric halted his horse, his breath catching in his throat. Isolde sat on the stone altar, not as a captive, but as a sovereign. She wore the garments of the forest, the ceremonial dagger resting across her lap. Surrounding her, perched on fallen stones and half hidden in the shadows, were wolves. Hundreds of them. Their yellow eyes were fixed unblinking on the Alpha King. Beside Isolde stood the massive charcoal Alpha, Cinder. He let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the ground, causing the war horses to skittish and dance nervously. Edric dismounted, signaling for his men to stay back. He walked slowly towards the center of the clearing, stopping a dozen paces from the altar. He removed his gauntlets, a gesture of peace, and dropped them onto the moss. "Isolde," he began, his voice rough, "you address the Queen of the Crags, King Edric." Isolde replied, her voice echoing with that same strange, dual resonance Kaelin had heard. It was not the voice of the girl he had ignored in his halls. Edric swallowed his pride. It tasted like ash. "Queen Isolde, I have come to apologize." A faint, cold smile touched her lips. "Have you? Or have you come because the northern banners are on your horizon and your iron cannot fight the roots?" "Both," he admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. "I underestimated you. I mistreated you. I listened to poison when I should have listened to counsel. Lyra's poison was sweet to you because it matched your own arrogance, Edric." Isolde said softly, her gaze piercing. "You built a cage of velvet and stone, expecting the bird to sing for you. You never realized the bird belonged to the sky. The North marches on Oakhaven," Edric stated, getting to the heart of the matter. "If they attack, thousands will die. The kingdom will burn." "The kingdom you stole," she corrected. "The kingdom you hold with fear." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But it is the kingdom we both rule. I ask you to return, not as a captive, not as a necessity, as an equal. We can forge a new pact." Isolde looked down at the dagger, tracing the ancient runes. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. The wolves watched, completely still. "I cannot return to Oakhaven, Edric," she said finally, looking up at him. "The air is too thin there. The stone is too cold." Edric felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. It was over, however, she continued, standing slowly. The wolves shifted, a wave of dark fur rippling through the clearing. "I have no desire to see the North bleed. My ancestors protected these lands. They did not seek to drown them in fire." She descended from the altar, stopping just a few feet from him. He had to look up slightly to meet her eyes, not because she was taller, but because her presence was so overwhelmingly vast. "Here are my terms, Alpha King," she declared, her voice ringing clear. "The Blackwood, and all the lands north of the Silver River, belong to me. They are an independent sovereign state. The Crag Lords will answer only to their queen. Oakhaven will withdraw all garrisons from the border." Edric calculated quickly. It was a massive concession, losing a third of his territory. But it would stop the war. It would secure his northern border behind a wall more impenetrable than stone. The magic of the deep woods. "And Lyra?" Isolde asked softly, the danger in her voice palpable. Edric didn't hesitate. "She sent armed men into your domain without my order. She is guilty of treason. She will be exiled, stripped of all titles and wealth. Isolde studied his face, searching for deception. She found none. He was beaten, pragmatic to the end. Agreed, she said, raising the dark dagger. She slashed it swiftly across her palm. Edric drew his own small blade and mirrored the action. They stepped forward, pressing their bleeding palms together. The blood remembers, Isolde whispered. The pact is struck, Edric answered. He turned and walked back to his men. He looked back once before mounting his horse. Isolde stood amidst the ruins, the wolves gathering closer around her. A dark queen in her rightful court. He had lost a wife, but he had finally understood the power he had so foolishly mocked. The Alpha King rode away, leaving the shadow to rule the dark. The final chapter resolves the conflict not with a bloody battle, but with a tense negotiation. Isolde uses her newfound power to secure independence, demonstrating growth from a victim to a sovereign ruler. Edric's surrender highlights the limits of brute force and his realization of his fatal flaw. The resolution is bittersweet but empowering. The legend of the Shadow Queen of the Blackwood spread far beyond the northern borders. It became a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of power, a reminder that the most formidable strength often lies in the quietest souls, and that mocking the seemingly fragile can awaken ancient, devastating forces. Isolde never returned to the stone corridors of Oakhaven, finding true sovereignty amidst the ancient roots and the loyal wolves. If you enjoyed this journey into the Blackwood, please like the story, share it with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe for more tales of magic, betrayal, and unexpected power.